Somewhere in a facility cooled to within a fraction of a degree of absolute zero, a Chinese research group is running a calculation that, by their own published account, would require the world's most powerful classical supercomputers longer than the age of the observable universe to replicate. The machine doing this is not a data center. It is a cryogenic chamber roughly the size of a chandelier and the leading flagship accelerator from the dominant force in artificial intelligence compute is not even a relevant comparison point for the specific task being claimed. Two industrial bets snap into focus the moment that result lands on the table. The quantum displacement bet that a sufficiently scaled quantum machine eventually collapses the economic case for the graphics processing unit data center, and the classical continuity bet that silicon and parallelism remain the only compute paradigm that actually ships at production scale for every foreseeable planning horizon. The evidence for each is real. The gap between them is enormous, and pricing that gap honestly is the only work that matters here. The contested anchor running through every weighing that follows is the sampling benchmark, a specific class of computation where the machine's output distribution is, in principle, impossible for classical hardware to efficiently fake. Both sides are fighting over this metric because it is the most credible current home for a quantum advantage claim. If a quantum machine holds a real sampling advantage at meaningful scale, the economic logic of the graphics processing unit data center begins to soften at its edges, at least for certain workloads. If the sampling advantage keeps collapsing under pressure from classical simulation teams, the quantum bet is a research curiosity that reprices further out with each passing year. That benchmark will appear at each weighing, first as the quantum side's strongest card, then as the specific place where classical hardware has repeatedly closed a gap that looked permanent, and finally as the open question whose resolution moves the line more than any other single result in the near term. The export controls that severed China's access to leading-edge accelerator supply did not freeze the country's compute ambitions. They reoriented them. A constraint designed to hold one road closed became the pressure that accelerated investment in a different one. The quantum program that emerged from that reorientation is now a credible participant in the sampling benchmark race, with a publication record that has grown sharply and state capital concentrated in ways that differ structurally from how Western quantum programs are funded. Whether the road that reorientation built eventually intersects with the problem classes that justify today's graphics processing unit data center build-out is the question the evidence has not yet answered. Pricing the gap between those two things is where the honest analysis begins. The first weighing sits squarely on the sampling benchmark itself. The Chinese photonic sampling result, published as a preprint and not yet peer-reviewed at the time this script is written, claims a quantum advantage that scales with circuit depth in a way classical simulation cannot efficiently chase. The team's own benchmark is the evidence on the table, with no independent classical simulation rebuttal published yet, and no independent quantum group having reproduced the result. The quantum side has a point on the board. The odds, however, move only modestly toward the quantum bet because the historical base rate on exactly this kind of claim is poor. Google's quantum team demonstrated a similar sampling advantage years earlier, and within roughly 2 years, a classical simulation group had substantially closed that performance gap using optimized tensor network methods on standard hardware. The pattern has repeated more than once. Quantum announces advantage, classical catches up faster than the announcing team projected, and the finish line moves again. A preprint with no peer review and no independent reproduction sits at the beginning of that pattern, not the end of it. The quantum contender earns a credible position in the race. It does not yet earn the lead. The second weighing is where the quantum bet takes a clean, unqualified loss, and it is worth holding on this point without softening it. The claim is that quantum hardware can, in principle, handle the combinatorial optimization problems underlying logistics, drug discovery, and materials simulation, exactly the problem classes where graphics processing unit scaling hits diminishing returns. In practice, the machines that exist today cannot run those optimization problems at commercially relevant input sizes. The reason comes down to the gap between physical qubits and logical qubits, and that gap is worth rendering in physical terms before pricing it. Imagine trying to transmit a single clean musical note across a room filled with interference. Playing the note louder does not help because the interference gets louder too. Instead, you play the same note on dozens of instruments simultaneously, monitor in real time which ones drift out of tune, and use the majority signal to reconstruct the original clean pitch. That corrected note is your logical qubit. Every physical instrument in the room is doing work just to protect that one clean signal. A machine with hundreds of physical instruments might be producing, in practice, a handful of clean notes, and a symphony requires thousands. Multiple independent research groups, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, estimate that the physical qubit counts required to reach fault-tolerant logical qubit operation for a real-world optimization problem are several orders of magnitude above what any current machine fields. A machine with hundreds or even low thousands of physical qubits running at current error rates yields a handful of logical qubits at best. The commercially relevant problem sizes require logical qubit counts that do not appear on any announced roadmap for this decade, and that estimate assumes error correction engineering proceeds without the plateau that has stalled prior generations of hardware. On the metric that actually matters for displacing graphics processing unit workloads, the quantum bet is behind by a margin that honest roadmaps do not close before the early 2030s at the earliest. That loss is price flat. The classical bet holds the displacement line firmly. The third weighing addresses the constraint became catalyst thesis directly. China's quantum program, forced outside the dominant accelerator supply chain by export controls, has concentrated engineering talent and state capital on quantum hardware in a structurally different way than Western programs funded through distributed venture and corporate channels. The publication record supports the thesis. Peer-reviewed output from Chinese quantum groups has increased sharply, and reported government budget allocations for quantum research are large by historical standards for basic research. The bet that the constraint became a catalyst has real support. The line moves toward the quantum side on the timeline question. It does not move past even money on the displacement question, because the physics bottleneck in error correction is not a funding problem. Google, the major ion trap players, and the leading superconducting qubit programs have spent heavily for over a decade without closing the logical qubit gap at the pace their early roadmaps projected. Coherence time, gate fidelity, and crosstalk at scale do not yield to capital the way fab capacity yields to capital investment. There's no documented mechanism by which a different funding structure sidesteps the underlying physics. The constraint became a catalyst for participation in the sampling benchmark race. The evidence that it catalyzes a machine capable of displacing data center workloads is not yet in the peer-reviewed record. The fourth weighing takes the best long-run argument the quantum bet can make: molecular simulation for drug discovery and material science. Both fields are pouring capital into infrastructure, and a quantum advantage in simulating molecular behavior could, in the long run, redirect that capital. The overlap is real across a long enough horizon and nearly invisible across the near-term planning horizon that data center investment decisions actually use. The artificial intelligence data center build-out is responding to demand that exists today for inference on deployed models and training on the next generation of foundation models. Quantum simulation of molecular systems at scales where it outperforms classical approximation methods has been demonstrated in peer-reviewed literature, but only for very small molecular systems. Scaling that result to the molecular sizes relevant to actual pharmaceutical drug candidates requires, again, the logical qubit counts the field does not have. Peer-reviewed quantum chemistry results from multiple groups confirm the small molecule advantage exists. No peer-reviewed result demonstrates that advantage at the scale of a realistic pharmaceutical target. The odds on near-term capital redirection stay with a classical bet. The molecule simulation question is the most honest long-run uncertainty in the whole analysis, and the line there is genuinely open over a multi-decade horizon. It does not move the planning horizon line. Now, the decisive weighing, where the three strongest risks to the quantum bet are held together before synthesizing them. First, the claim versus reproduction problem. Every major quantum advantage claim in the past several years has been contested within months by classical simulation teams using improved algorithms. The pattern is consistent enough that any single unverified claim should be discounted heavily until an independent group either reproduces the quantum result or demonstrably fails to close it classically. Second, the physical versus logical qubit problem. The gap between announced physical qubit counts and the logical qubit counts required for commercially useful computation is the single largest structural risk to the quantum timeline. Until a machine demonstrates sustained logical qubit operation at a scale above single digits in a peer-reviewed result, the displacement thesis is a projection. Third, decoherence and gate fidelity at scale. The window in which a superconducting qubit holds its quantum state before the environment destroys it is, in the best current systems, roughly the duration it takes light to cross a modest-sized room, a few nanoseconds to low microseconds. Every gate operation and every error correction cycle has to complete inside that window. coherence times and gate fidelities that look strong in small systems have historically degraded as qubit counts rise because crosstalk and control complexity scale faster than the qubit count. No group has published a peer-reviewed demonstration that fidelity holds at the scale required for fault-tolerant operation. Synthesizing those 3 points, the quantum bet is real on the narrow question of whether a quantum machine can perform a task no classical machine can efficiently replicate. The quantum bet is not competitive on the broader question of whether that advantage translates to the workload classes that currently justify the graphics processing unit data center build-out. Those are 2 different bets, and conflating them is where the hype enters and where the odds get mispriced. The single result that moves the quantum displacement line most is not a sampling benchmark win. It is the absence of any demonstrated quantum speedup on a problem that a graphics processing unit cluster was actually asked to solve. Every claimed advantage to date lies in problem classes constructed to be quantum friendly. Random circuit sampling, boson sampling variants, and similar benchmarks that no production workload actually runs. No quantum machine has outperformed a modern accelerator cluster on a problem the accelerator cluster was deployed in production to solve. That absence is the most honest current read of the displacement question available. 4 concrete catalysts will move the line from here, and pricing them forward is where the analysis gets its clearest traction. The first and highest leverage near-term catalyst is independent classical simulation of the most recent Chinese photonic sampling claim. If a Western or independent classical simulation team publishes a demonstration that the claimed advantage can be substantially reduced using improved tensor network or related methods, the quantum bet on the sampling question takes a significant hit. The historical pattern repeats, and the burden shifts back to the quantum side to demonstrate advantage at deeper circuit depths or larger system sizes. If no classical rebuttal appears within roughly 12 to 18 months, and the result is independently reproduced on a different quantum system, the sampling advantage line moves meaningfully toward the quantum bet. This catalyst does not resolve the displacement question either way, but it is the most immediate signal the sampling race will produce. The second catalyst, and the highest impact one for the displacement question specifically, is the first peer-reviewed demonstration of more than roughly 10 logical qubits operating below the fault tolerance threshold on a single machine. That result does not yet exist in the peer-reviewed literature for any architecture, Chinese, American, or European. If it arrives with peer review and independent confirmation, the displacement timeline compresses and the quantum bet reprices sharply upward. It is the result that would most change the analysis here. The third catalyst is a major hyperscaler publicly integrating a quantum coprocessor into a production artificial intelligence pipeline, not a research partnership, but an actual workload running on a hybrid system in a revenue-generating service. Its continued absence, despite years of research investment, is itself evidence that the gap between quantum hardware capability and production workload requirements remains wide. A production integration would reprice the near-term line without resolving the long-run displacement question, because it would likely reflect a narrow quantum-friendly workload rather than general displacement. The fourth catalyst is a Chinese government quantum roadmap with independently verifiable milestones and third-party audit. The constraint became catalyst thesis rests on claims about engineering progress, not just publication volume. A roadmap with auditable milestones would allow external analysts to track progress against claims. Its absence means the thesis is supported by publications, but not by the kind of external verification that moves institutional capital. On the sampling benchmark question, the evidence places the odds modestly in the quantum bet's favor, with significant uncertainty from the reproducibility gap and the historical base rate of classical catch-up. On the displacement question, the evidence places the odds firmly with a classical bet for this decade, and likely the first half of the next. The export controls did produce a reorientation, the publication record supports that, and the engineering investment is real. What the constraint catalyzed is a quantum program that is now a credible participant in the sampling benchmark race. Whether it catalyzes a machine that displaces the data center is the open question, and the honest odds say that answer does not arrive this decade. The sampling benchmark, the metric both bets have been contesting throughout, sits at a genuinely interesting position right now. China holds a credible claim on it. That claim has not been peer-reviewed or independently reproduced, and classical simulation teams have a documented track record of closing exactly this kind of gap. The benchmark is live, and the line is moving on the sampling question. On the displacement thesis, the line is not. The quantum bet survives its early years of rebuttals and keeps repricing outward rather than collapsing, which is itself a signal worth holding. But anyone pricing quantum displacement of the graphics processing unit data center as a near-term event is carrying a position that the current evidence does not support at those odds, and the catalysts that would justify it have not yet landed. Which bet would you back with a 10-year horizon, the quantum road or the graphics processing unit road, and what specific result would it take to move you off your current position? Put your catalyst in the comments. If you want the odds updated as those results arrive, the classical rebuttal, the logical qubit milestone, or the hyperscaler integration announcement, subscribe, because this channel prices the line as it moves.